Hi, I hope you'll enjoy the episode you're about to listen to, but you should know that this podcast would not be possible without the generous support of some of our listeners who contribute either through Patreon or directly on our Buzzsprout website. I'd like to thank Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, Steve Zank, Scott Henrich, Deborah Hilger, Mikhail Legner, Abigail Anoa Broyles, and Rosa. Thank you. Welcome back to the Lutheran History Podcast. Today's episode is going to sound a little bit different because I'm actually a guest on another podcast, the Shepherd's Study podcast, hosted by Jared Natsis and Phil Moldenhauer. They were gracious enough to share the audio of that episode, but this is the same episode that is just now being posted as well by this other podcast. They're going to introduce the podcast in just a few seconds and tell you about it. It's another podcast I encourage you to subscribe to if you find the same sort of topics interesting.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of Grow in Grace, your partners in continuing education and professional growth for pastors, welcome to the Shepherd Study Podcast. I'm Jared Natsis.
And I'm Phil Moldenhauer. The Shepherd Study is a series of book reviews that we produce for brother pastors in the ministry, and our aim is always to help pastors grow in the art and practice of pastoral ministry care, what they're doing. With this podcast, we're trying to bring a conversational element to these reviews. And so, in each episode, we're going to pick a book, we're going to discuss it with the reviewer, and we're going to be engaging in some shop talk.
So imagine you're at a circuit meeting, specifically a coffee break during the meeting, not actually the meeting itself. You're just having a conversation with the brother pastors, chatting, talking about a book. That's the kind of informal but informative discussion that we're looking to have here.
And here we go. So today, we're going to have our informal but very informative discussion with Pastor Ben Phelps about the book Brand Luther by Andrew Pettigrew. So welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Great. So, Ben, before we begin, we always like to just find out a little bit about your ministry context. So tell us where you're serving and what's happening at your church and what's on the horizon there.
Yeah. So after the first 5 years of ministry in Alaska, wonderful place with wonderful people, the Lord led us to come to Marathon, Wisconsin, just west of Wausau. Most people know where that is. And the big thing that's going on right now in ministry, we're at actually my office at the Child Care Center, so that's kind of my focus with my associate pastor. We split a lot of the regular ministry stuff as well. But the big thing on the horizon is probably something that maybe the microphone will actually be picking up the sound of construction vehicles right outside my window. We're building a brand new worship center, ministry center, worship space, a new church building on a new location. So that is a wonderful thing that I get to be part of in my own way.
Yeah, that's really exciting. When's it going to be done?
Roughly how far from Wausau? Like 26.2 miles, would you say?
No. Yeah. Although, you're doing your marathon trivia. Yeah, that's fine. But no, on that point, there's a town called Athens just north of here. And they used to, the story goes back in the day, have people run an exact marathon between Marathon and Athens.
That's awesome.
But that's
I just love the Wisconsin towns that had delusions of grandeur when they chose their names. You know, Athens, Rome, Wisconsin, New London. You know, they're like, hey, it worked for New York, so why doesn't it work for New London and New Berlin? You know, like, I just love those. Cambridge, Wisconsin. So,
yeah. Some of those you could say are like, oh, it's we're classically minded people, right, who laid out the map, and we're just making good references, book references maybe.
Nice.
Some of them I noticed too are like Paoli, just south of Madison, is like town in Italy where Napoleon won one of his first battles or something. They're just dropping history references, and is the name of these towns. So I love that.
Right up your alley. So
Yep.
tell me when the sanctuary is going to be done.
We're right now tentatively, but I guess it's on a podcast, so it's official now, tentatively looking at July 27th of 2025.
Okay, so construction's in the early stages now.
Yes, yep, just poured some concrete for the lower level this past week.
Okay.
Nice.
Well, that's really
awesome. Very
exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Good.
Another history connection, 2025 is marking the 175th anniversary of the Synod, so it's kind of nice to have a milestone year with a milestone event for the congregation, too.
Nice.
Love that.
Good.
Well, hey, let's get
All
into
right.
the discussion then, because we've got before us one that has kind of made the rounds in the Synod. This is Brand Luther by Andrew Pettigrew, with a subtitle that's basically the preface to the book. How an unheralded monk turned his small town into a center of publishing, made himself the most famous man in Europe, and started the Protestant Reformation. So, Ben, why don't you just give us kind of a little bit of an introduction to the book, Pettigrew, what he's going for, and kind of that catchy title, Brand Luther. What's going on here?
Yeah, so I think within the concept, the title itself, and even the cover of the book, normally don't judge the book by the cover, but everyone does, right? It's a very impressive book cover. I think it's even like textured, right? Maybe Jared, I think you have a copy with you.
Mine is not. If there is a textured version, I cheaped out.
It's
Oh, you guys
printed
both
to
have the
look like
soft
there's
cover.
texture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My hardcover is like, as the letters coming off the page. Well, anyway, I think what he's going for, though, is, I wouldn't quite say it's a popular history of the Reformation, but he's definitely going for like an accessible way for him to kind of talk to people who might be interested in branding in general, tied into a history of branding, while also trying to tell, an accessible but not super deep story of the Reformation at the same time. And the basic premise is printing, even though it had been invented 60 years plus earlier than Luther's time in Wittenberg started, they didn't seem to know what to do. They knew how to reprint some classics or book lists for universities, but nobody could really be truly said to have been a bestseller. And he was implying that printers really struggle to have a broad market, and that Luther inadvertently but very successfully led to kind of a new phenomenon of a living author actually being popular. That was a new thing. And on the flip side, Pettigrew argues that Luther's popularity through printing is what made the Reformation successful, not just because it spread ideas, which was true, but also his personal popularity may have helped keep him alive as well. So it was kind of a mutually beneficial relationship that Luther had with the press, although it was not intentional. That's the basic premise of the book.
Yeah. Okay. So you said it's at least adjacent to a popular history. I mean, it's published by Penguin Books, so I think that's a good indicator that we're more in the realm of the popular history. And it came out, I believe it's maybe a 2015 or 2016 copyright, but I think it got a lot of publicity because of 2017 being the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So
2015,
and
you were right.
2015. Okay. Yeah. So, I think this is like something that it seems like everybody just universally assumes that the Reformation wouldn't have happened without the printing press. So let's start with that thought. I mean, this book seems to be kind of right in that line of thinking. How do we analyze that? Does Pettigrew add some new information to our understanding of that? Or what do you think, Ben?
Well, it's certainly not a new idea to suggest that the printing press had a large impact on the Reformation. That's been recognized for a long time. Let's put it that way. So he's not exactly offering anything new there, but there's certainly something there kind of from a secular point of view, and that's maybe something we can get to a little bit later. How do people in the church view church history, and how does the world view church history? Pettigrew and others who are going for a popular, more secular style of history, they're not going to be at all acknowledging the hand of God or any divine providence, anything like that. They have to come up with a natural, reasonable explanation for everything, right? And to be fair, you can do that. The classic example is compare Luther to John Huss, right? And he was in his own lifetime, and that's something Pedigree gets into in the book. Huss didn't make it because he wasn't as well known. He didn't have a protector prince. He wasn't as popular. He was burned at the stake about 100 years before Luther. But because as Luther went into the Diet of Worms, the whole town were waving around Luther's works in their hands and stuff. So he uses that kind of anecdotal evidence as pretty powerful evidence to say, look, Luther's printing put a lot of political, social pressure on the emperor and the church itself not to act too hastily, or at least not to act with impunity. There's going to be resistance to stamping out Luther. So I think there's something to it for sure. And we, of course, say, well, God would probably be behind the success of the press working that way. But just looking at the facts on the ground, it holds water.
And it reminds me of when I was in high school. I remember sophomore year history with Terry Vassell, Professor Vassell at MLS. Shout out. He had this it was a History Channel documentary on VHS that was like the 100 most influential people in world history. And every time we got to one in the regular curriculum, he would show us that section of the VHS about that particular person, whether it was number 15 or number 55 or whatever. And when we got to Luther, he was number 2. And we just harassed him, like, who's number 1? If Luther's number 2, who's number 1? Who's number 1? And he always was kind of cagey about it, and it was kind of a running joke. Finally, last day of the school year, he pops in, who's number 1 on the History Channel list, and it was Gutenberg. And so even just that marriage of the Reformation with the printing press, I mean, this is not a novel idea, right? So I guess my question is then, what does Pedigree bring to the discussion that History Channel didn't have on VHS already in 1994 or before, Yeah.
Well, I would hope a 400-page book would add some depth to a History Channel episode. It almost has to, just to add something to it.
I would agree.
And I want to be balanced here in being critical, and I don't know personally, and maybe this is where you guys saw something I didn't. I didn't see exactly that much of him carrying the argument that Luther was like this expert brander. My feeling is that it was more of I see the anniversary coming, I'm going to get ahead of it on the book market. I know a lot of people like the Reformation history, but there's also a lot of people who really get into branding and marketing and churches too, kind of any kind of church growth flavor title, can kind of help pull that along. That being said, he does talk about Luther's attention to detail in the printing and Luther's very intentional care for the audience. So it's not as if to say Luther was this ahead of his time self-promoter, in a way just by default, by being the first living best-selling author in the printed era. It kind of was, it was about him to some degree, but he wasn't necessarily, from what I got out of the book, someone who's really trying to brand himself as an individual or his movement per se. That sometimes comes out in the polemics, right? He worked with the Chronics with woodcuts, just some really, really effective, hard-hitting woodcuts that show the Pope in contrast with Jesus, for example. The Pope as Antichrist, right? He's sitting there on his throne while all the kings of Europe are bowing down, kissing his feet, contrasted side by side with Jesus kneeling, washing his disciples' feet, for example. So Luther worked with that. He knew how to use the visual media to get a message across, no doubt about it. One of the interesting things, little tidbits I picked up that Pedigree pulled out, which I hadn't heard before, was how his first printer was just not cutting it. He was really slow, not necessarily sloppy, but just really no artistic ability at all. If you ever pull up like an image, you can go to Google Books or Wikipedia Commons or something, pull up any Reformation era book. Even though it's black and white or maybe black and red printing, those title pages are works of art, right? They have all these woodcuts in them. And even if it's just printed text, at least you have that very first letter is huge and massive. It's meant to draw the reader in. Well, apparently, this first printer would just print Luther's works basically in 2-3 bland columns, no bigger sized font for the headings or the title. It was just looking at a sheet of paper with words on it. Luther did start to complain about that. And he said he refused to have his gospel apostles printed by this printer because he said it would be a disservice for the ministry, and also the gospel deserves better than that. So that was maybe for me at least the main couple points of how Luther worked with the press. He was very active. That's another thing he pointed out too. He would in Wittenberg they had 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 5 presses by the time he was done there. He would stop in those print shops and do quality control or offer comments. So Luther was very active in the visual appearance and the content of what was being printed, at least locally.
Yeah, that's as I think about this book, that's what I think I found intriguing was we don't often spend a lot of time when we're studying Luther imagining Luther as this man, I guess let's put it this way, of the world, a man who's actively involved in all down to the nitty-gritty details of what the printed works themselves look like when they're coming off the press. I thought there was some new information there, or stuff that I had not heard before. And I think that whole thing about Luther's relation with the press is an interesting concept. In some of his letters, he'll make jokes about it, like I've got to go home and feed the pets because they're demanding food. He's talking about the printers, like they are looking for material from me. And I think pedigree is good in rounding out our vision of who Luther is, and not imagining him like only solely as a preacher who is like, all his head's only in the Bible and in the classroom or pulpit, and not also a man who's got his nose to the ground, I guess, and working on those things. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there comes the overstatement to say, the Reformation only succeeded because of the printing press. But then there's also the understatement, which would be that it just kind of happened around Luther, and he was this, almost accidental benefactor of his place in history. I think the book brings out is that Luther was not ignorant to the art of working the press and working the system a little bit, into which he was there. He was not ignorant to it. He was actually quite savvy, even ahead of his time, as it comes to the word branding, right? Not to overstate it and say that's the only reason he succeeded, but to give him credit where credit's due as to how he kind of saw the usefulness of it. So I think that was valuable to see.
Yeah, so you bring up that word branding. So Ben, let's talk about that. Like, it seems anachronistic, right, to call it branding.
Oh, it is.
So
yeah. They didn't talk that way back then. So
is Luther a social media influencer?
Right. Yeah. Well, it was with the wood. So the interesting thing is, it's not just, like I mentioned, printing text, but they figured out we can do this with pictures too. Instead of having just the princes and the bishops have fine art in their chapels and castles, now the mass population could have these woodcut quality pieces of art too. So the two kind of media you had, the printed word and the printed image. Luther mastered it, and he was wise in the way he did it. At the very end, Pedigree notes that after Luther died, the other Lutheran reformers in Wittenberg, still influential, didn't spread their work out evenly to all the printers as Luther had done. He was trying to spread it around so everyone could stay busy, maybe maxing out his efficiency, but also kind of keeping the local printing economy going. The reformers after him didn't necessarily do that. At least that's the argument Pettigrew was making. So yeah, Luther definitely he was just a gifted man, right? Some have certified him as a genius in the technical sense of the word, even though he's been dead. Like he just well gifted in many areas. So being able to master the media after he realized what it was doing was fine. But also this has a lot to do with his Christian character too, which I think is maybe the deeper reason why it worked so well. He didn't care if he was plagiarized. Not in the sense like they didn't necessarily use his name, but if his ideas were being recopied by another printer without his permission, that didn't upset him. And this is because he wasn't so much focused about getting credit, and he never took money for anything either. That's another big point too. He could have been, rich if he had set up a way to be charged for everything that he printed. But he didn't care because he was more content focused or source formed rather than goal oriented, at least in a selfish way. Yes, he wanted the message to get out. He was conscious of the audience, but he also wasn't so concerned about, will this be popular or not? Will this be well received or not? And I think that is the big tension I would have with Pettigrew's interpretation of the whole branding thing, because he says, Luther was foolish with Zwingli. He just got his pride and his stubbornness got ahead of him at Marburg, and he ruined like this branding team building opportunity because he stood by what he thought Scripture said about the Lord's Supper or the Peasants' War too, for example. Well, Luther missed out on opportunities there to increase his popularity. And if that's Pettigrew's conclusion on some of those points, then he's kind of missing the deeper Luther behind the superficial brand Luther that's coming out in the book.
Yeah, if Pettigrew's takeaway is that Luther should have gotten a better PR team, it's like, okay, so that's maybe where we're not seeing eye to eye here. I think it's funny that you talked about Luther being content focused, because that's so true. However, that's another term that kind of we've anachronistically changed, and even what it means. We talk about content in the form of like stuff that you put on social media, or like the content machine, and you got to keep your content going. But that's not what you meant when you said that. You were talking about Luther cared about the substance of what he was saying far more than he cared about the monetary impact or the kind of personal gain or outcome from it. He actually believed everything he was putting out there. He was doing this marketing or quote unquote branding because he wanted the gospel to be proclaimed, and he wasn't in it for the self-image or for the self-promotion. It was all in service of something else, which I think is where the anachronism comes in when you talk about brand Luther. It wasn't brand Luther. Luther didn't want it to be brand Luther. He wanted it to be gospel. He wanted brand gospel, you know?
Yeah, so if you want to substitute the word content, the way the word Luther would have used would be the word, right?
There's message.
That quote. That quote attributed to him, and I can't remember if that's been debunked or not, but I think it summarizes it well, where Luther said, I did nothing, the Word did everything, right? And doesn't that summarize kind of what we should take away from this book, right? The Word did everything, I did nothing. So to that point, though, just quickly, around the context of the Marburg colloquy, the other guy that Luther gets upset with, besides Zwingli, is Martin Bucer, because Bucer supposedly... he really did take some of Luther's words about the Lord's Supper and edit them ever so slightly, reprint them to make it look as if Luther actually agreed with Zwingli. This was before Marburg. Then Luther got mad, right? It wasn't that he was reusing his words. It was that he was twisting his words, which in Luther's thought wasn't just his words. He was really just the messenger. He was twisting the word of God. So that's when he would have an issue with that.
I mean, is it fair to say, though, that Luther does have an ego, and that sometimes it does come out? It seems like this is a popular view of Luther now. I'm thinking not only of Pettigrew, but also of Tom Holland and his work on Luther. Like he's going to say that Luther, to a certain degree, does just kind of have, this desire. I don't know. I mean, that's not incompatible with a man who loves Jesus and loves the word, is it? That he also realizes, he's made a name for himself. I don't know. What do you think about
I guess show me evidence that he has an ego that's driving it would be kind of my, quick follow-up to that.
Sure. Yeah. And related to that, I don't know. I'm curious about the role of the printers, and if we read into a 16th century context, the modern economy. Tell me about that. Is it fair to say that the printers in Luther's day were these modern capitalists who were looking to make profits? And that, I just don't know. I'm curious about that.
Well, I think human nature is inclined, or at least the sinful nature is inclined to acquire wealth and prominence and such. Of course, we have to remember back then, wealth almost didn't matter as much as, in many cases, it didn't matter as much as your honor or status. We are still working in a feudal system with classes, which has the cons that we normally talk about today. Well, now we're free to be whatever we want. And supposedly that's a good thing. But also had some pros back then, too, that don't get talked about so much. But one of the things that Pedigree points out is in Wittenberg, being kind of a backwater town, which he highlights a little bit, there was kind of a social power vacuum. So someone kind of on the marketing, to use that word, printing team, Lucas Cranach, the elder, became mayor of Wittenberg as someone who just would have been kind of a craftsman, tradesman, artist, was able to elevate himself socially and also financially. So that being said, yeah, people printed what would make money. And they had to support themselves, and if they got rich doing so, they would probably do that. But of course, there were restrictions on that. You go to neighboring, not electoral Saxony, but the Duchy of Saxony, where Frederick the Wise's, I think it's his first cousin, Duke George, had a big issue with Luther, and he forbade his printers in Leipzig from printing Lutheran stuff. So they wanted to, but they were restricted from doing that. Once he died and his son became Lutheran, they said, great, we can print all this stuff and actually make some money. So yeah, there was a lot of restrictions on that, what they could do, but it made sense to make money. And Luther, Melanchthon, and Justus Jonas were the top three sellers of this time period, Pedigree points out.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
They would print Lutherans if they could.
Yeah.
So kind of tie it together in terms of what Pedigree is really going for. On page 159, he has a Cranach woodcut with a cover of one of Luther's works of the institution of the ministry. And it just says, this is brand Luther. Here are all the elements of marketing Luther are included. The highlighting of a name and a place, Cranach's distinctive title frame, and then if you just look at it, you see, the bold words, the readable font, all of that stuff, and so you just kind of see the distillation of what Pedigree says. Hey, this is brand Luther. It's visually catching, it's easily readable. And it has the author and Wittenberg. And if you think about the cover of this book, which I know we don't have a visual podcast, although we are on Zoom right now, you see this. And then if I just close it and show you the front of the book, which looks like a, book cover you'd see on the shelf, the kind of idea persists, right? So you get to see Luther's savvy as a graphic designer of sorts as well, which I guess leads me to a question, which is, we've admitted that the brand idea is pretty anachronistic in terms of how we're kind of imposing 21st century thought onto this 16th century person. But what are the takeaways practically for us now as pastors and kind of forward facing, whether we like it or not, social media presences? What do we learn from Luther that we can retroactively put from the 16th century to the 21st?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you often hear this, Luther learned how to use the printing press, and that was wonderful. Ergo, the technology we have today must also be wonderful, and we should learn to master it. Like, as if there's a direct correlation. People will say the printing press was the social media of the day. I don't know. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. You can pros to this. How did Luther first disseminate the small catechism? It was on a printed poster to put up in your homes, right? So maybe the first home poster ever was a Luther small catechism. So yeah, he definitely, where it could affect and touch people's lives, he tried to use it for good by sharing the word of God. So wherever the social media then could touch people's lives, then we spread it. Maybe, right? I don't want to say no, but I think it's like you already pointed out. It's not exactly the same thing, and that caution there of not trying to just do what will get popular or likes or clicks or views or attention shouldn't be the primary goal.
The mediums are different, like printed. Yeah. It's one of the curious things is that Pedigree says Luther is brief, and you read his stuff and you're like, this is not brief. If that's the case, then you look at social media and it's brief to the extreme. Everything just gets pared down to mere sound bites. And so I think we should have a note of caution before we draw these kind of direct parallels, just because the medium is quite different. Like what Luther is printing allows him to develop a well thought through and, as you said, a source formed argument, to teach and expound the word. And you can't do that with a meme. It's not the same. So we can't just say these are exactly identical situations and things like that.
But it is about the audience, and it's impossible to calculate how many people are literate. I've heard numbers 10, 15% for Luther's time and place being literate. He did use basically memes, though, with those chronic woodcuts. Here's a cartoon of the Pope with some words underneath where your literate neighbor can tell you. So, he pretty much did do the short form media, too. That being said, it was all about the audience. He would write a lot in Latin if he wanted this to be academically discussed outside of the German-speaking Europe. But where he knew his audience would be German-speaking townspeople, he would use maybe simpler language and then in the German language as well. So I think you need to really factor in the audience, and that's what Luther did, too.
Yeah, I think we all understand in this Zoom call here that the statement of, Luther knew how to work the new technology of the printing press, ergo, we as pastors should know and understand and learn how to market ourselves on the current technology of social media. It's like to put the printing press and, TikTok as a one-to-one comparison is invalid. But there is an element there that does say basically what you just said, Ben, is like, how can we get the message to the people where they're at? And is there a tool we can use to do that maybe we're not factoring in or maybe not using or utilizing to its fullest extent? And that's at least a good question to ask. Now, you might end up answering it by saying, no, I'm not going to start a church TikTok account. But at least you're considering the avenues of the message and the way to get it out, because like Luther, and here's the actual takeaway, is the message is the thing driving it. You talked about being source formed. We don't want to be just trying to gain the numbers on the external. We want the message to be the thing to go from inside to out, to the people. So there's a takeaway to be had here from the idea of brand Luther, but it's not the most obvious takeaway.
You mean, Jared, we didn't start this podcast to become really popular and therefore become rich and famous?
Hey, Buzzsprout sent me an email that we have over 100 downloads on the first 2 episodes. So, we're on the up and up. We're getting there to the moon.
Woo! That's exciting.
I do understand the irony of me talking about what I just talked about while we are on episode 6 of a new podcast that we're trying to launch to get, yes, it's not lost on me. It's not lost.
Right. And you recognize the value of it. Well, and back to that earlier point too, Luther wasn't a printer. It wasn't his print shop, right? He was using other people who knew how to use that media. And if this is focused towards a pastor audience primarily, well, think about it that way. Do you know someone who does know how to use that other media, whatever form it may be, right? It doesn't have to be a giant time suck. It doesn't have to be a new skill you must have to be an effective pastor, right? And maybe that's kind of what a synod is for too, right? To have people who can pool our resources together to get the word out.
There's a nice vocational application there that Luther, he recognizes quality in print, and he wants and demands quality in print, so like trying to raise people up in their vocations and then provide them with business rather than, it's such an American thing to be like, I'll just do it myself. You see here this kind of interaction or networking that Luther is using, or whatever you want to call it. Again, helping the printers, but also demanding that they do good work.
And I guess maybe my last point for current takeaway is this: like, most pastors are actually involved in printing stuff every week, right? And maybe it's hopefully obvious, but when you assume it's obvious, then maybe you miss out. If you are printing a service folder every week, and people are coming to look at that service folder to see and hear and participate in the Word of God and worship, that should probably be a top-notch quality thing, right? And we have resources to help us with the images and making it look good, but maybe just a simple reminder there that counts for something. Luther certainly would see it that way.
That's a really good point. I like that. I mean, we're all running our own publishing companies, so to speak. Yeah. We run through a lot of paper in my congregation, so you're making me think.
Every house a church, and every church a mini printing press.
Gutenberg would be so proud.
One thing just about the one-to-one comparison of the printing press to modern social media. I heard this brought up at a conference last year. That probably the main difference that we have to pump the brakes on that comparison is just the rapidity of social media and the fact that, the printing press, while they did want things to be pretty consistent and pretty quick to churn out, I mean, just the mere movable type process took time, and you had to have editing. I mean, you had to have well-crafted stuff put out there. Whereas I think, I'm not the first person to say that people could just launch whatever they want onto the internet, right? I mean, here I am recording my voice off the cuff for somebody else to listen to. And that's why we have to have this big disclaimer on the podcast that says that the thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are not because what if I say something not very carefully, or, that could be misinterpreted? I'd hope I'd be lovingly called on the carpet for it. And I'd hope that I'd lovingly be able to say, yeah, I definitely messed up there. That's, I think, the key, not the key, but a key difference in the world that Luther was branding in and the world that we find ourselves branding in. It's just, everything can be quick, rapid, unedited, unfiltered, for better or for worse.
Well, ease your conscience, Jared, because Luther did print some things we wish he wouldn't have printed.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
The editors didn't always catch it. And
Twitter fingers were pre-Twitter sometimes as well, as far as Luther's concerned.
Ben, what, in your opinion, what's the biggest weakness in this book?
Well, it's just kind of the approach is just, when you talk about the work of God without seeing God as part of the story, you're going to have some blind spots, right? So that's just a general weakness of what was missing the goal, Pettigrew's goal that he kind of wanted Luther to have of being popular and just building a temporal movement versus the kingdom of God. That's maybe the weakness, and just it's a godless book, even though it talks about God, right? Just the perspective from which it's written is not one of faith, and that's just important to remember. And I call it defensive reading. You're taught in driver school probably be a defensive driver, right? Just be safe, kind of watch where you're going and watch where things are coming from as they come at you. Same thing with reading. Just not that you have to prejudge everyone who isn't Orthodox confessional Lutheran writer and say it's all garbage. That no, they have points, they have opinions, but his conclusions about what's important for a man of the church to do was slightly different than what I would say it is. So the pastoral ministry applications are harder to just copy paste.
Yeah, you gotta dig for them a little bit more, be a bit more critical in the thinking before you come away with your takes. One thing I wrote in a note that I slipped in the book when I read it was that it tries to be both a Reformation history and a marketing history and doesn't really fully execute either.
Agreed.
That's kind of where I land on it. It's not a bad book. And I don't think that's a waste of time or anything, but you gotta know you're not gonna fully mine the depths of either of the two topics that he's really trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, so Ben, tell us then, should Lutheran pastors pick up this book and read it if they have not at this point?
I would say if you're looking for a well-written, easy-to-read book on Reformation history because you haven't brushed up on it for a while, or you just like reading that stuff, it is on the to-read list, just with some of those cautions that we've mentioned already. It does a pretty good job of walking you through the Reformation and talking about some of the important printed works of Luther.
Okay, well, that wraps it up. Brand Luther by Andrew Pettigrew. I think that's a good place to end today. So thanks so much for joining us today, Ben.
Very happy to be here. I had a good time.
Yeah, thanks. We really appreciate the time you took reading the book. And by the way, if you didn't know this, Ben hosts a podcast that is posting episodes pretty regularly. It's the Lutheran History Podcast. So can you just tell us about that quickly, Ben?
Sure. On the day of our recording, it happens to be the very birthday of the podcast. Been doing it for exactly 4 years now. It's a podcast where I read books or articles, usually by other Lutheran historians, whether they're professional or independent historians, and we talk about whatever it may be. And I try to cover all 500 years of Lutheran history. Can't possibly talk about everything, but it's a pretty wide scope of content, both kind of narrow focused in on Wells history all the way back to the Reformation and some broader topics.
Yeah, so check that out. That's on all your major podcast platforms. You can find that, the Lutheran History Podcast, and you can scratch your Lutheran historical itch with some really great content. By the way, to find Ben's polished thoughts on this book, Brand Luther, you should check out our website, shepherdstudy.org. There you'll find a review of all of the archives, all of the Shepherd Study reviews that we've done, and that includes Ben's review of Brand Luther by Andrew Pettigrew.
While you're there, you can check out the dozens of other reviews on the Shepherd Study and other Growing Grace resources as well. So thanks again one more time, Ben, and thanks for the Lutheran History Podcast for helping us get off the ground as well with helping us with some of the tech side. We appreciate your help there weeks ago at this point, so we're indebted to you on that. Thanks, Phil, for hosting with me. Thanks to my sister Claire for recording our intro music, and of course, thanks to you, the listener. We hope to see you again next time on the Shepherd Study Podcast.